maybe just to put into perspective even more for people when you talk about how subjective these diagnoses are, I thought I would read off just straight from my PDF version of the DSM-5, the current edition of the Book of Mental Disorders, just some of the criteria for attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and perhaps even provide people with a little bit of context. So I don't want this podcast episode to be as informational as much as I want it to be personal. However, here is, I think, helpful information. The construct of ADHD appeared for the first time in the revised edition of the DSM-3 in 1987. The first edition of the DSM in 1952 did not include any version of this, and then the second one in 1968 included the initial description of what would eventually become ADHD. It was known as hyperkinetic impulse disorder. And then in 1980, the DSM-3 came out, which included ADD. And then during the next 7 years, the APA generally agreed that hyperactivity is inherent in this condition. So in the revised edition of the DSM-3 in 1987, ADHD appeared for the first time. And so the diagnosis of this condition rose steadily throughout the 80s and 90s, but has dramatically risen in the past 20 years. And I just want to so there's some historical context, and to give some context around exactly what this condition is, what the symptom criteria are, here are some. So basically it's defined as a persistent pattern of inattention and or hyperactivity or impulsivity that interferes with functioning or development. And there are two aspects to it: inattention, so attention deficit, and hyperactivity. And interestingly, you only have to meet the criteria for one of them to get the diagnosis of ADHD. So for inattention, you have to have 6 or more of the following symptoms having persisted for at least 6 months to a degree that is inconsistent with developmental level and that negatively impacts your life. And then there are a list of, I think it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 possible. Yeah, 9 possible symptoms, right? And I'll just read off about 3 in the interest of time here. So 1, often fails to give close attention to details or makes careless mistakes in schoolwork, at work, or during other activities. Often does not seem to listen when spoken to directly. Often avoids, dislikes, or is reluctant to engage in tasks that require sustained mental effort. And those are just 3. There are 9 total. You have to meet 6 of them, or 5 if you're an adult, actually, but 6 if you're under 17. And if you do, you qualify for a diagnosis. And then there are symptoms listed that describe hyperactivity, like often fidgets with or taps hands or feet, or squirms in seat, or often unable to play or engage in leisure activities quietly, or often has difficulty waiting his or her turn. So you can hear in the language that there's room for interpretation, a lot of room for interpretation. And that is just cannot be, overstated here. The fact that there's so much room for interpretation about what often means, or whether or not this behavior being described, like that the person doesn't appear to be listening when being spoken to directly, making the judgment about whether that is truly happening and whether it is, abnormal, it's up to the person diagnosing. And I also, I don't mean to talk too much here, this is about you, but when I read the DSM, I acknowledge that it's a very, very well thought out, carefully made document. And I think it has some value. It's helpful, it's valuable to identify patterns of behavior And indeed, patterns of behavior cluster together. And no doubt that probably is reflective of personality dispositions or maybe neurological profiles. But that's not, that's not all the DSM is. The DSM is used as a medical tool to help diagnose people with these disorders. So it's more than just making keen observations and collecting data around patterns of human behavior. It's used for more than that. And then perhaps what is kind of most problematic of all is the fact that we don't really know what is causing these patterns of behavior, but we treat these conditions as if we know exactly what's causing these patterns of behavior. And we don't.